Okay, let's talk about gamification.
Yes.
We hear that term a lot. Let's begin with the definition from you, perhaps. What do you consider gamification?
It's an excellent point, and I actually avoid the term. As you were in my most recent talk, I didn't use that term, even though it was put in the title of my next presentation. And the concern is that I think when people think of gamification, there's sort of a sense that you're infantilizing the process. Well, I'm going to get a badge, yay! And the challenge here is that we're doing serious training for business, and me and medicine, and for health of patients. So I think the key element is, can we take specific game elements, game mechanics, and incorporate them in? So the gamification, as someone said, if you add badges, it means you're badgifying. If you add leaderboards, you're leaderboardifying, you know, and so I tend to avoid that moniker itself.
So what are the elements that you might include learning, that you borrow, let's say, from the gaming world?
There have been 3 that we've really looked at in depth. One has been looking at rewards, in terms of how can we structure this in such a way that people can find some value in this. And the rewards, I'm not talking about necessarily giving them gifts for the highest prize, but to structure it such that Gabe Zickerman, with his gamification focus, has put forward a hierarchy for rewards that he talks about. And it's called SAPS, Status, Access, Power, and Stuff. And status you can gain, I mean, there are people that you wouldn't believe what they would do to be top of a leaderboard. Or to have, I'll give an example in my talk of somebody who paid $14 million so they could have a vanity license plate in Abu Dhabi that had the number 1 on it. I know, that seems a bit, that was before the financial crisis. And then so access, there's a classic one is Guilt is a site which allows access to sales earlier for it's people who spend $10,000 or more in a given year. Power, we see this a lot in video games. And then Stuff is the lowest. It can have value, but in terms of pushing forward, it's more problematic in that one, it costs money, and 2, you have to distribute all this. And Daniel Pink brought forward some work that had been done at Princeton back in the 60s, which looked at how can external rewards change how people enter into tasks in terms of creativity, and whether this sort of extrinsic motivation can undermine the intrinsic motivation. I have to say, I think his writing is very provocative in terms of the specifics and how he extrapolates from a candle test, for instance, that he gives. I don't necessarily agree with his extrapolation, but I do think it brings up a larger point, is that there's not a linear correlation between greater rewards and greater performance, and that if you can focus on things that are considered very valuable, intrinsically valuable rewards for people, but not necessarily monetarily valuable, that I think you get more bang for buck.
So in this hierarchy, which of these would you consider intrinsic motivation?
Well, I wouldn't. All of those rewards, all those are extrinsic. And then the question would be, with the intrinsic motivation of the individual, the key would be to try to align these extrinsic rewards, status, access, power, stuff, with their intrinsic motivation, so it actually works to strengthen it rather than undermine it. And it's a challenge. I'm still learning this a great deal myself.
So what would that look like? Give me an example of aligning intrinsic and extrinsic.
So I can tell you an example when it doesn't. So we just completed a randomized trial of about 420 residents out at UCLA looking at training for healthcare quality. And the randomized trial specifically looked at game elements versus not. So they got the same baseline iterative questions over time, but one group were assigned teams. They were given team rewards. They were given aliases, and their scores were placed on a leaderboard so they could see how they did. And it was very interesting to see we looked at engagement over time, and they started at the same when they began, but those who were in the team groups and with the leaderboards and all, we saw a dramatic improvement in their response time over the 10, 12 weeks that we did this, and those who didn't really sort of tailed off. The tough thing with this, and this is why I mentioned this in context, is that the challenge here is that medical residents, and I don't think I'm giving away state secrets, but this healthcare quality training is frickin' torture, and the last thing they want to do. So the question was, how could we devise a system, to deliver that content in a way that they would engage and participate? And so the tough thing here is we didn't align, that they didn't want to do this. It was, but on the other hand, once we got them in there, exactly, we were still able to overcome the lack of intrinsic motivation by this system, which with these game mechanics.
Okay.
So that said, the greatest bang for buck that we get are programs where the content is specifically that someone feels is of value. And if we use this methodology with content that they feel is going to help them in their sales training or be better doctors, then we are aligning those two motivations.
Right.
So the other things that we've looked at are teams and leaderboards. With regards to the teams, there was a beautiful article that came out in April in Annals of Internal Medicine by Volpe and his group at Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, where they gave people who were with a body mass index of 30 to 40, rather large, makes them difficult surgical candidates for me, and gave them an incentive where each month an individual, if they met a weight loss target, would get $100. So they randomized to two groups. One group had that individual incentive. The other had a group of 5 people, and if the group met the weight loss target, that each individual would then get $100. So same amount of money per individual, just structured differently. And they found that those people that had the group rewards had greater short-term weight loss, and that this weight loss was maintained more effectively long-term as a result of structuring the incentives of that way. And we've begun to use these. One funny aspect of this has been, we did a study with the Harvard medical students first year looking at ethics. And this was an experimental question type that was open-ended and allowed people to vote as to what answer they liked the best. And part of the rationale with this was that most of life's questions, are in the gray zone. There's no correct answer. So how can we devise a question type that can probe those sort of interesting nooks, and ethics seemed like a good way in which to do so. But the leaderboard that we provided actually had people's names on it. And we thought this would be quite motivating. Well, it was motivating, but it was motivating in that they didn't want to participate. Because what happened is that people who didn't perform well were on the leaderboard and felt shamed.
Right.
And so on one hand, I've spoken to companies and talked about this, and they're like, yes, we want people's names there. We show sales results, and we publish them with everybody's name on them. So we have a culture of this sort of accountability, and we want to align with that. On the other hand, when I've been doing studies with the nurses, and most recently with about 2,100 employees at the VA Boston for accreditation training, that we want to create a safe environment. And so we've given them aliases, and so that they actually, and teams, but this gives they feel safe, and if they miss the question, they don't feel that they're shamed, but they're still motivated to participate for their team.
So they know if they're doing well, and if they're not doing well, nobody else knows.
Exactly. I mean, the supervisors do,
yeah, but
it's mainly...
It's not public.
Exactly.
Display.
It's not, they're not going to be shamed in front of their peers. So it's been an interesting balance. And I mean, we're learning all the time as to what works well and what doesn't in different environments. But overall, we've been very pleased.
Okay. So we have teams.
Yes.
What was the third one?
So there were the leaderboards. And then that's been very interesting as well, because I just remember when I was coming, I played tennis in high school and would come back, and the kids would be at 7-Eleven, and they'd be surrounding an asteroids machine, and you'd look at the leaderboard on there, and you get 3 initials you could put in there, and on the leaderboard. If I never made it on there, but if you did, that's how you would identify yourself. And it was like, Abe, had 14 million, and I'm going, oh my God, there is no way. I don't have enough quarters,
right.
Either do my parents for me to reach that level. So then the question was, in that context, the leaderboards can be interesting, but they're not motivating. And what we found is that it's very important to keep them safe or not, as we discussed, but then the other is to present them in a way that are motivating and relatively meaningful to the person who's participating. So you can have a top 100, you can have the top teams, but what's very helpful is to see where you stand, and if you're number 38, to see who the people or the aliases are who are 37 and 36, and how many points you need to go up on them, and do you know them, and are they from your sales district? Are they from that other nursing thing, other nursing ward, so that it can allow you then to, that it's placed, rather than an absolute scale, we use a relative scale, which is much more motivating.
So you don't put the actual scores on the board?
We do. But the actual scores, but we don't, instead of, people can access all the leaderboards, but what we show them initially is relative to their close peers.
Okay.
Again, to try to focus on the motivation, so it's an incentivizing force rather than the asteroids, and it's disincentivizing 14 million top score.
Right. So you don't want them to feel hopeless.
Exactly.
There's no hope for me. You want them to feel that they have a reasonable shot of improving.
Exactly. And so it's been a lot of fine tuning as to how do you structure this in order to get an effective learning experience. And luckily, you know, we've been very successful. The ethics one at Harvard didn't go too well, but we learned a lot. But in general, the recent ones have gone very well.
Great. So maybe as a closing thought, if you consider professionals that are in the area of instructional design, learning designers, maybe electronic or mobile learning designers, what advice would you have for them based on the research that we've discussed today?
It's an excellent question. One thing that we have, it's specifically about mobile learning, that we've seen is people trying to put PDFs on a cell phone or PowerPoints or streaming videos of lectures onto phones. And I mean, people can try to do that. A lot of current material on LMSs is in that format, and I can completely understand the desire to want to try to repurpose that for mobile devices. But what we have found is that the question explanation nugget of information that can be delivered is actually a very, if you can design around that, and
right.
Specifically for your question, that can be very effectively delivered over these mobile devices and engage learners in such a way that these other products cannot.
Great. So it really maximizes the platform capabilities of mobile.
And
works around some of those limitations.
Works around some of the limitations, but also capitalizes on some of the benefits that you're able to offer a rich, engaging, potentially social, team-based learning experience that has demonstrated results.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for the interview.
Great conversation.
My pleasure.